Stop everything, because this is the moment that flips the entire story on its head. After months of silence, speculation, and carefully worded distance, Pierre has finally spoken, and what he revealed is not the clean, polite breakup narrative fans were fed. This wasn't about busy schedules. This wasn't about drifting apart, and it definitely wasn't mutual confusion. According to Aaron's own words, there was a truth he'd been holding back, and once it surfaced, there was no going back. For months, the internet blamed timing, careers, and pressure. But insiders say Aaron's explanation cuts far deeper, exposing emotional fault lines that were invisible on red carpets and carefully cropped photos. The kind of fault lines that don't explode loudly, but quietly destabilize everything from the inside out. When Aaron finally broke his silence, he didn't attack. He didn't deflect. He admitted something far more unsettling. Staying would have meant becoming someone he didn't recognize anymore. Fans are already spiraling. Old interviews are being replayed with fresh ears. Subtle moments that once felt romantic now feel tense. And a single sentence from Aaron, described by sources as calm but devastating, has sent shockwaves through social media. The realization that love wasn't the issue, alignment was. This wasn't a breakup caused by one argument or one mistake. It was the slow unraveling of two people realizing that what they needed from love no longer matched. And what Aaron finally revealed forces one dangerous question into the open. Were they holding on out of love or out of fear of letting go? Because once you hear his truth, everything you thought you knew about this breakup changes. The silence broke quietly, but the impact was anything but. According to people close to Pierre, the reason he finally chose to speak wasn't to control the narrative or counter Teyana Taylor's honesty. It was because the version of the breakup circulating had drifted too far from his lived experience. And when Aaron revealed his side, it didn't contradict her truth. It complicated it in a way that made everything heavier. Insiders say Aaron didn't frame the breakup as something that happened to him. He framed it as something he recognized. A slow, unsettling awareness that the relationship was asking him to move in a direction he wasn't emotionally prepared or willing to go. Not because he didn't care, not because he was distant by choice, but because the emotional pace and expectations between them had begun to feel mismatched in ways neither could ignore anymore. What stunned fans was how introspective his explanation was described to be. There were no accusations, no defensiveness, just a sobering admission. He felt himself adapting, adjusting, reshaping his emotional instincts to fit something that demanded more intensity than he naturally operates with. And while compromise is normal, Aaron reportedly realized he was compromising his sense of self rather than negotiating a shared middle ground. Friends say this realization didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in through small moments, conversations where he felt overwhelmed rather than connected, emotional exchanges where he felt pressure to respond correctly instead of authentically. Over time, that pressure turned inward. He began questioning whether staying meant constantly measuring himself against expectations he couldn't meet without pretending. That word, pretending, has now become the uncomfortable bridge between both of their truths. According to insiders, Aaron's revelations centered on emotional compatibility rather than fault. He acknowledged that Teyana leads with her heart, speaks from deep emotional presence, and values intensity as connection. He also acknowledged that he processes differently, more internally, more slowly, more quietly. At first, those differences felt complementary. Over time, they became a source of strain. Aaron reportedly admitted that he started to feel like his way of loving was being evaluated rather than understood. That his calm was sometimes mistaken for distance, his reserve mistaken for lack. And while he tried to stretch, to show up more visibly and verbally, it began to feel unsustainable. Not because the effort was wrong, but because it wasn't organic. Insiders emphasized that this wasn't about emotional avoidance. Aaron wasn't shutting down. He was realizing that being in a relationship where his natural emotional rhythm felt insufficient was eroding his confidence. He began to feel like he was failing at love despite caring deeply. And that's a devastating place to be. One source described the breaking point as quiet clarity. Not an argument, not a fight, just the moment Aaron realized that staying would mean constantly overriding his instincts to meet a version of himself the relationship required. And he knew from experience that living that way leads to resentment for both people. What makes his revelation hit so hard is that it doesn't invalidate Teyana's pain. It explains it. Her feeling unseen and his feeling overwhelmed were two sides of the same disconnect. She needed more emotional presence. He needed more emotional permission to be himself. Neither was wrong, but they were no longer aligned. Social media, predictably, reacted with intensity. Some accused Aaron of being emotionally unavailable. Others praised his honesty. But people close to him insist that labeling him as distant misses the point. He wasn't unavailable, he was mismatched. And mismatch, when ignored, becomes misery. Aaron reportedly spoke about the fear that kept him quiet for so long, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being painted as cold when he was simply different, the fear of hurting someone he respected deeply by admitting that love alone wasn't enough to bridge the gap anymore. That fear is why his truth landed so calmly yet so forcefully. He didn't need to dramatize it, he needed to name it. Insiders say Aaron acknowledged his own part in the pretending. He admitted that he tried to adapt instead of speaking up sooner, hoping the discomfort would settle. He believed that if he just showed up better, communicated more, stretched himself further, things would stabilize. But stretching without relief only leads to breaking. What fans are grappling with now is the realization that both narratives can be true at the same time. Teyana stopped pretending because she felt unseen. Aaron stopped because he felt he was becoming someone else. Their truths don't cancel each other out, they intersect. This reframes the breakup not as abandonment or failure, but as two people reaching the same conclusion from opposite sides of the emotional spectrum. One needed more, the other needed space to be exactly who he was, and the space between those needs became impossible to ignore. By finally speaking, Aaron didn't expose a scandal. He exposed a reality people rarely talk about. That emotional compatibility isn't about effort alone. It's about whether two people can meet each other without one of them shrinking or stretching beyond recognition. As this story continues, one thing is already clear to those closest to both of them. The breakup wasn't caused by a lack of love. It was caused by the moment both realized that continuing would require pretending in different ways. And once that truth surfaced, there was only one honest choice left: to let go before love turned into resentment. That revelation may not be dramatic enough for those craving villains, but it's devastating enough to change everything. Once Aaron Pierre put words to what he'd been holding in, the story didn't settle, it deepened. According to insiders, his explanation wasn't a rebuttal to Teyana Taylor's truth, but a missing layer that exposed how the same relationship can feel suffocating to one person and starving to another. And that realization cracked open a far more uncomfortable conversation about emotional labor, expectations, and the silent negotiations couples make without realizing the cost. Aaron reportedly spoke about the slow build of pressure, the kind that doesn't announce itself as conflict. He described moments where affection felt conditional, where reassurance felt required on a schedule he couldn't keep without forcing himself, not because he didn't want to give it, but because giving it on demand began to feel performative. Insiders say he used a phrase that stunned those listening. "I felt like I was passing a test I didn't know I'd signed up for." That sentence alone reframed months of speculation. Friends say Aaron's internal conflict centered on identity. He values steadiness, reflection, and measured expression. In the early days, that balance felt grounding. Over time, it felt scrutinized. He began to sense that his natural pace was being interpreted as distance, his quiet as withdrawal. And instead of defending it, he adapted, hoping adaptation would be enough. It wasn't. According to sources, the more he adapted, the less authentic he felt. He started editing his reactions, rehearsing responses in his head, anticipating what would be read as caring versus cold. That constant self-monitoring is exhausting, especially for someone who connects best without performative intensity. The irony, insiders note, is that the more he tried to meet expectations, the more pressure he felt, because expectations kept escalating. Aaron reportedly acknowledged that Teyana's needs were valid. She wanted presence, affirmation, emotional visibility. He didn't dismiss that. What he struggled with was the implication that love required him to operate outside his emotional wiring. "I can grow," he said, according to one source, "but I can't become someone else and call it growth." That distinction became the axis on which everything turned. As this perspective spread, social media split into familiar camps. Some accused Aaron of hiding behind emotional style to avoid doing the work. Others recognized the nuance, understanding that emotional labor isn't one size fits all. Insiders say Aaron anticipated the backlash and accepted it as the cost of honesty. He wasn't trying to win the internet, he was trying to stop lying by omission. What complicated everything was how neatly his truth aligned with Teyana's, even as it diverged. Her statement about not pretending anymore landed as a refusal to shrink. His explanation landed as a refusal to stretch beyond recognition. Put together, they describe a relationship held together by effort rather than ease. Effort can sustain love for a while. It can't replace alignment. Friends describe a pivotal conversation where Aaron finally articulated what he'd been suppressing. Not as an ultimatum, but as a confession. He admitted he was afraid that speaking his truth would be interpreted as indifference, afraid that naming his limits would hurt someone he cared about. That fear kept him quiet longer than he should have been. Silence, he learned too late, can be just as damaging as confrontation. Insiders say the aftermath of that conversation was devastating in its clarity. Once the truth was spoken, there was no dramatic fallout, just a shared understanding that the relationship had been running on borrowed time. Teyana's honesty removed one layer of pretending. Aaron's removed another. What was left was respect, and an ending that couldn't be postponed without causing harm. The public narrative, however, struggled with this complexity. It's easier to label one person as emotionally unavailable and the other as demanding. But those who know both insist the reality is messier and more human. Teyana wasn't asking for too much, she was asking for what she needs. Aaron wasn't withholding, he was protecting his sense of self. Those needs collided. Aaron reportedly addressed the idea that he checked out. He pushed back gently, explaining that he never stopped caring, he stopped overextending. There's a difference, he said, between withdrawal and boundary setting. One comes from apathy. The other comes from self-preservation. He recognized too late that he needed the latter. This reframing forced fans to revisit old moments with a different lens. The calm demeanor, the careful wording, the absence of oversharing. What once looked like emotional distance now looked like consistency. And what once looked like romance now looked like expectation. Not because anyone was wrong, but because they were different. Insiders say Aaron also confronted his own responsibility in letting the mismatch persist. He admitted he should have spoken sooner, should have named his limits before resentment could take root. By trying to be the version of himself the relationship seemed to require, he delayed an inevitable reckoning. That delay, he acknowledged, hurt both of them. The phrase "truth exposed" resonated because the truth wasn't scandalous, it was structural. The structure of the relationship required constant calibration. One person turning up the volume, the other turning it down. That push and pull can feel passionate at first. Over time, it becomes exhausting. As this second phase of the story unfolded, something else became clear. Aaron's explanation didn't absolve him, and it didn't indict Teyana. It named the space between them. And that space, unaddressed, was the real reason the relationship couldn't continue. Friends say Aaron's calm delivery was intentional. He didn't want to inflame or invalidate. He wanted to be precise. Precision, however, doesn't always land softly. It lands clearly. And clarity can sting when it dismantles comforting myths. The biggest myth to fall was the idea that effort equals compatibility. Aaron's truth challenged that head-on. Effort matters, he said, but only when it's building toward ease, not propping up a misfit. Love shouldn't feel like a performance review. And when it does, something is off. As the dust settled from his revelation, the conversation matured. Less finger-pointing, more reflection. People began sharing their own stories of relationships that ended not because of betrayal, but because of misalignment that honesty finally exposed. In that sense, Aaron's truth resonated beyond celebrity. What remains is a sober understanding. Two honest people can love each other and still need to let go. Not because they failed, but because they listened. And as Aaron's side of the story continues to circulate, one conclusion feels unavoidable. The breakup wasn't a mystery solved by a single confession. It was a mirror held up to a reality many couples avoid naming until it's too late. In the end, the truth Aaron exposed wasn't about why he left. It was about why staying would have cost him himself. And once that truth was spoken, the ending wasn't cruel. It was necessary. By the time Pierre's full explanation settled into the public consciousness, the narrative had transformed from breakup gossip into something far more sobering. A study in emotional incompatibility that neither side could outwork anymore. Insiders say the final stage of Aaron's truth wasn't about justification. It was about acceptance. acceptance that love, respect, and effort had all been present, and still, the relationship had reached a limit neither could push past without losing themselves. Those closest to Aaron describe a quiet reckoning that followed his decision to speak. Not relief, not triumph, just steadiness. He wasn't trying to set the record straight in a competitive sense. He was trying to stop the story from flattening into something unrecognizable. According to sources, what bothered him most wasn't being misunderstood. It was watching a complex ending be reduced to blame when the reality was about boundaries finally being honored. Aaron reportedly acknowledged that clarity often arrives too late, that if he had named his emotional limits earlier, the ending might have been gentler, or at least less confusing. But hindsight doesn't undo the months spent trying to adapt, trying to rise to expectations he never agreed were the standard. In the end, he realized that staying quiet to preserve harmony only delayed the harm. Silence didn't protect the relationship, it prolonged its misalignment. This final phase reframed the breakup as something neither dramatic nor scandalous, but definitive. Friends say there was a moment, after all the conversations, after the honesty on both sides, when it became clear that continuing would require one of them to keep pretending. And both had reached the same boundary from different directions. That convergence is what ended it. Not anger, not exhaustion, clarity. What's striking is how Aaron described the emotional aftermath. Not devastation, but grief paired with self-respect. He mourned the relationship without wishing it had been different in ways that betrayed who he is. He didn't romanticize the struggle. He didn't vilify the need for more emotional presence. He simply accepted that his way of loving wasn't wrong, and neither was hers, but they no longer fit together without friction. As this understanding spread, public discourse shifted again. Less outrage, less finger-pointing, more recognition. People began to see themselves in the story, not as celebrities, but as partners who tried to bridge emotional gaps with effort alone. Aaron's words resonated because they named a quiet fear many people live with, the fear that being yourself won't be enough for the person you love. Insiders say Aaron was particularly careful to avoid reframing Teyana Taylor's honesty as pressure or demand. He didn't want his truth to be weaponized against hers. In private conversations, he reportedly emphasized that her needs were valid, even if he couldn't meet them sustainably. That distinction mattered, because invalidating someone's needs is easier than admitting you can't fulfill them without self-erasure. This is where the story lands hardest. Aaron's truth didn't expose a secret betrayal. It exposed a structural mismatch that effort alone couldn't solve. He spoke about the difference between growth and self-negation, how growth expands who you are, while self-negation compresses you to fit a mold. Once he recognized he was compressing himself, the decision became unavoidable. The final conversations between them, according to people familiar with the situation, were grounded in respect. Painful, yes, but not cruel. There was no attempt to rewrite history or diminish what they shared. They acknowledged the real moments, the care, the admiration. They also acknowledged that admiration isn't the same as alignment, and care doesn't guarantee compatibility. What emerged in this final stage was a shared boundary. Neither would continue a relationship that required pretending. Teyana named that boundary first. Aaron named it in response. Their truths, once spoken, didn't collide, they clarified. And clarity, once present, doesn't allow for half measures. Public reaction inevitably remained split. Some still wanted a villain, others wanted reconciliation. But the story no longer supported either desire. It had moved into a quieter, more uncomfortable space where endings don't provide catharsis, only understanding. That's a harder story to accept, especially in a culture addicted to dramatic conclusions. Aaron's final reflections reportedly centered on responsibility, not blame. He took responsibility for staying quiet too long, for hoping adaptation would solve what honesty needed to address. He also took responsibility for choosing himself before resentment could harden into something uglier. That choice, he knew, would be misunderstood by some. He made it anyway. As the dust settled, one thing became clear to those watching closely. This breakup wasn't a failure of love. It was a success of self-awareness arriving before damage became irreversible. Too many relationships end after respect is gone. This one ended while respect was still intact. In the end, the truth exposed wasn't a shocking revelation meant to flip loyalties. It was a sober admission that emotional compatibility isn't proven by effort alone. It's proven by whether two people can meet each other without one shrinking and the other stretching past recognition. When that balance disappears, love becomes labor, and labor eventually collapses. Erin's honesty didn't negate Teyana's pain. It explained the other side of it. Her feeling unseen and his feeling overwhelmed weren't opposing truths, they were parallel ones. And parallel truths, when finally acknowledged, lead to the same conclusion. The conclusion wasn't dramatic, it was final. And that finality didn't come from bitterness or betrayal. It came from two people choosing integrity over illusion. From naming limits before resentment could poison what was once genuine. From accepting that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for someone you care about is to stop pretending you can be what they need. That's the truth Erin finally revealed. Not why he broke up with Teyana Taylor, but why staying would have meant breaking himself. And once that truth surfaced, there was no alternative ending left to choose. If you've stayed all the way to this point, don't click away now. Because this is where stories like this either get flattened into gossip or understood for what they really are. What Pierre finally revealed wasn't tea for entertainment's sake. It was a rare, uncomfortable truth about relationships that don't fail loudly, but end quietly when honesty finally catches up. And this is exactly why you need to stay locked in. Breakups like this don't end when one person speaks. Context keeps evolving. Old interviews hit differently. One future comment, one lyric, one candid moment can completely reframe everything you thought you understood. If you're not here for that evolution, you're only getting half the story, and half the truth is how narratives get distorted. So don't just watch, engage. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Do you think emotional mismatch is harder than betrayal? Do you believe love can exist without compatibility? Or do you think one person always ends up carrying more emotional weight, no matter how calm things look on the surface? Say it. These are the conversations people avoid, and that's why they matter. Hit like if this breakdown made you rethink how you judge quiet relationships. Subscribe immediately, because when the next layer of this story surfaces, and it will, you'll want the full context, not a headline designed to confuse you. You'll want to understand why this ending happened, not just react to it, because the most dangerous breakups aren't the messy ones. They're the ones that look peaceful until the truth finally speaks.